My name is host Eric. I'm the host Talking with Famous People, and today we're talking about MBTI type, union cognitive functions basically, and learning style, way that you acquire new information. So I guess in order to talk about that, the first thing we have to do is discuss what it means to learn something. And that's kind of a challenging question, because learning is as much a matter of how it's taught is how it's learned versus the other way around, you know? So if I prepare you to pass a test in which you provide correct answers to a series of questions, then I'm not just teaching you something, I'm teaching you a modality of learning as well. And I think, you know, and in fact, a frame for your whole life in existence. I think that's what school does. It frames things out. It says, here's how we usually function in these small groups, each of which has its own hierarchy, and you got to fit into that hierarchy, and yada yada yada. So the way that people learn, though, there's a couple of different ways that people mean that. So you could mean auditory or visual learners. When I say auditory and visual learners, what I'm talking about specifically are the following things. Visual learners are more likely to learn by taking notes on paper with their hand, not on a laptop, and then seeing stuff on a board, and they'll tend to remember what they know based on that psychogeographical quality that writing in space has, or pictures, diagrams, things like that that represent ideas. So a lot of times when I'm doing debate stuff and I'm explaining ideas, I'll draw pictures of the analogies I come up with, not really thinking to myself this is a good teaching technique, but just because for my own way of thinking, I'm always trying to come up with other possible ways of explaining things. It's just the nature of NE-DOMs, you know. So the auditory learner is going to get most of what he needs by listening and or reading. Reading is an auditory process. That's different from experiencing a lecture, for example, through the processing of visual cues on the information versus simply the words being said. The visual learners are the ones who are less quick on their feet, because they're not processing meaning directly from its auditory transmission channel, which is how we transmit language to each other. Even if we're reading it, we're transmitting it auditorily, because reading works the same way that listening does, in that it has duration. It takes time to read from the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence, just as it does to listen to somebody's saying the sentence. The only difference is that you get to control the tempo when you're reading. So what that tells us is that's one way that people learn differently. Another way that people learn differently is related to, as I started with, the way that they're taught. So, for example, I heard Courtney say in the video yesterday, and I thought it was really interesting. She was talking about she didn't want she always felt as though she didn't want the teacher to give her everything. She should be left to figure some parts out, and that when she in fact tried to teach kids like that didn't work. The kids wanted very specific instructions. Well, I think I've got a solution, so to speak, to this conundrum, because what we're dealing with here is a reality that NTs feel like, oh, well, they need to be allowed to figure some of it out because that's part of the process by which they understand themselves. And then there's a lot of other students who want really specific instructions because they're just trying to learn the material. They're not trying to dance with it, right? NTs want to dance with information. A lot of other types just want to learn the material for whatever purpose they need to learn it for, either to get a grade or to know it for some practical reason, or to learn about it for their own interests, or just to prove they can do something, or whatever other reason they might have. But it's not to dance with it. It's not to learn a piece of information that you can then slap around, right? Like NTs want to do that, especially ENTPs, and to a lesser extent, but still for sure, INTPs as well. We learn information so that we can punch it, and that's very different than how other people deal with it. However, the strategy is not to do what you suggested, which is let us figure it out. It's to go way, way faster. And the issue is, for an NT student, they think they want to figure shit out because they've never actually been adequately challenged. If you go fast enough and explain enough different ideas, they got their hands full just getting the handle on that, right? And learning how to actually utilize them in arguments. That's when you really start to understand things, is when you have to defend the position. When you have to convince a third party that you are right while somebody else is trying to convince them you're wrong. That's when you really start to understand what it means to understand a position. And school doesn't demand that of people. There needs to be, for NTs, the competitive element that says it's inadequate to learn the material to my standards. You need to learn the material to a standard independent of us both. That is to say, you can't just understand it well, you have to be better than the other people. You have to do a direct comparison. Who understands it better, me or Joe? Me, I get an A. Joe does not, he gets an F. And there's nothing in between. That win-loss thing is the motivating factor for, and the compelling reality, and the thing that makes us understand, or makes me understand, that why debate ought to be prioritized. This modality undermines the viability of the conventional setup entirely. Like, we don't have any cause to persist in the existing education methodologies because it's not attending to the question correctly at all. So you say, well, what are the different styles of learning? Unfortunately, regardless of whether it's auditory or visual, the styles of learning are dictated by the styles of teaching, and people learn in ways they ought not be learning. So if you're talking about, and it needs to be individuated, because for the INTP, for example, they're going to learn to read whole language style. So we should have a different set of expectations for them than we do for I don't know, somebody who learns to read differently. So what I mean by a whole language is, you don't need, as an INTP, to learn about phonics. You don't need to. You're born with a natural ability to get the idea of language and pick it up just by being read to and reading out loud yourself. And in fact, that's how you learn to develop a writing voice, is by just internalizing the way that well-written prose fits together, and the way that the rhythms of it roll together and stuff like that. Those things are naturally occurring to an NTP if they're exposed to language, or to any auditory learner who's intuitive, who's exposed to language. But they're not necessarily taught that way. They're taught phonics because phonics is considered more foundational. But that's not the way. Some people need to learn that way, and other people don't for reading. Another example is it's about why we're learning a given thing in school. There's not any instruction regarding that issue, like utility of the abstractions. And there needs to be, because for a lot of NTs, they're perfectly capable of mastering the material, but are finding themselves questioning a lot of the assumptions that go behind the way the school is set up in general. So this is going to change the learning style of an individual, because they're not going to be very trusting, whether they know it or not. I think that a lot of kids assume, they go into the assumption that, well, I mean, every kid goes in with the assumption that this is the status quo, this is what's expected, this must be the right thing to do, and it must be okay. And as a reality, when they get there, it starts to run afoul of their intuition, wherever it is, whichever one it is, and whichever one of the first two it is. If you're an NT, intuitively you start to go, there's something wrong with this. You as an ENTP, I tried to impress people, the teachers and stuff, and loved the FE kind of stuff that went along with school. I just ate it up, no problem. And yet there was lots of stuff I just couldn't hardly, at point of death, bring myself to do. So it ran afoul of my intuitive understanding of the way the world ought to work. And eventually you run into conflict with academic institutions. It changes the way you learn, because you start to be jaded. You start to be cynical about knowledge, about learning in general. You start to think that it's dead, because it's just a bunch of hoops you jump through so you can get a piece of paper, so you can be a wage slave, so that you can buy something.
Yeah. How do we fix this problem, though?
Well, I tell you what, Courtney just got here, and I want to stop this video, and I want to ask her to expand on her thoughts about education that she started talking briefly about when I was stepped away for a second yesterday in the video. I saw that part when I watched it today, and I wanted her to expand on that, and I was hoping to then discuss this education thing further within that framework. So thank you for watching this episode of Talking with Famous People, and we'll be right back with more.